Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Shul Jewish Cultural Community, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. We live in a noisy world, but we also live in a world full of sounds. What's the difference, you might ask? Well, sound is energy, and like other forms of energy, sound can be useful or disruptive. Which brings us to noise, sound that is unwanted or perceived to be unpleasant. But who's to say what's a pleasing sound and what isn't? Some people love listening to the rain, others don't. Some people love listening to opera, others don't. Sounds that are wanted one minute can be unwanted the next. So how can we inhabit a sonic environment that's predominantly pleasing to us? Can we manicure our soundscapes in ways that reduce clutter and anxiety? Can technology reconnect us to the sounds of nature? Has our species gotten so carried away with making sound and noise that we've eliminated the possibility of silence? These are big questions, the sort of questions today's guest thinks about.
We're amped to chat with Matthew Bennett, a composer, ethnomusicologist, sound artist, and founder of the design firm Acoustic Ecology. Matthew created and directed the Sound and Sensory Design program at Microsoft, where he made micro-musical compositions that are heard on billions of devices every single day. Matthew, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you, Joey. Thank you, Jonathan.
Jonathan mentioned soundscape. Would you mind explaining what that term means and how it factors into your work?
So the idea of soundscape refers to the entire acoustic environment as it's perceived and experienced by human beings in context. It's really a way of thinking about sound as an environment in which we are immersed, the way we feel sound as opposed to studying it theoretically or in isolation. So it's a way of understanding our experience as part of a system.
So how would that factor into maybe some of the sounds you've designed?
There's this massive global soundscape of technology that's created by the big tech platforms that we have today. Really, they really create their own soundscape. We're surrounded by those sounds of technology more than ever, and they really do create this kind of new type of audio ecosystem around the world. People are hearing those sounds all day long, and often, not just from their own devices, but from other people's devices. So it's really this audio environment, the soundscape that our sounds have to function in, and that they are partially responsible for. My sounds are partially responsible for creating, along with other designers of sounds for global platforms. We have these, tiny little sounds. They're maybe a half second long at most, maybe a second sometimes if you count the reverb tail in there. And they're heard on billions of devices all day long, every day. So that's really a massive amount of physical and emotional energy to be putting into the world each day. So using that idea of soundscape helps me approach conceptually and also very practically how to think about constructing those sounds. Are they a family? How do they sit in people's environments? How do they support people's attention and focus and the way we're processing information, or how do they detract from it if necessary to interrupt for a critical alert or something. But mostly it's about designing sounds that are calm and seamless and that really integrate well and create their own soundscape that is designed to interact with people's personal soundscapes.
So you're dealing with soundscapes not only individually, but individuals around the world. I'm assuming that your ethnomusicology background plays an important role in sort of understanding and trying to figure out the right kinds of sounds that may be universal or partially universal to speak to this diverse population?
Yeah, definitely. We don't want the sounds to feel like they're composed on the west coast of the U.S. in Seattle or Redmond and shove that on everybody else around the world. I guess that would be kind of a form of sonic imperialism. Not that we haven't been responsible for some of that in the past, as these major companies, but that's something I try to be really aware of. And my background in ethnomusicology, which is the anthropology of music, has really helped with an understanding of that. It's important to kind of think about the power dynamics, but also how the psychological and I guess I would say more specific emotional experience of the sounds. And that's where, we know sound is extremely subjective. Music is very subjective, even among people who share a cultural background, even among people, even among the same person at different times, right? So sound is, that's part of its power, but that's also part of its problem if you're a designer.
I know that silence is also pretty important to you as sound. So in what ways does silence or the concept of silence manifest in this sound art?
I think it's so important because it actually allows us to listen more deeply, not just in a metaphysical sort of spiritual sense, but also in a very practical way. A musical sound lives on after the initial impact and vibrations die away, and there are these kind of residual vibrations and resonances and sort of reverberations that resonate and sing. And I mean that in a very physical, literal sense, right? Whatever space you're in, this is happening, and the sounds are kind of overlapping, even if it's relatively silent. But it's in those places where we can really understand the feeling and process all the information that the sound is carrying, not just the physical information, but all the information behind that, the intention, the emotional and psychological dynamics that we're experiencing. Just like with language, if someone is just talking nonstop all the time, there's no chance for us just cognitively to even parse what they're saying sometimes, let alone really house it and internalize it and really be able to listen and respond to the meaning of what they're saying. So the silence mixed with the sound is really important, whether we're talking about language or sound design for technology or music. So sometimes I like to say that I design silence, and it's a little cheeky, but it's true. And a lot of times, what I do is remove sounds from experiences. The old idea that sounds had to be much more present in certain kinds of technology experiences doesn't necessarily translate today. Some of those ideas about the alarm-based sounds started out in the late 90s, early aughts, when our relationship to the devices was different, right? They might be our mobile devices might be in the other room, they might be in a backpack or a purse, and the idea was that you had to have a loud sound, intentionally kind of annoying, to capture attention, and so the person wouldn't either miss the message or miss the notification that their battery was dead or something like that. That whole paradigm is totally different now, right? Because our relationship to the devices is much different. They're right by us. You guys probably have your phone sitting right next to you, just like I do, even though we're on other devices as well. So they're just much more integrated into our life and like an extension of our body. So the kinds of sounds that it's appropriate for the devices to make is a much different kind of range, just the way someone on the street might yell at you, but someone in your immediate intimate environment hopefully is going to talk to you address you in a more appropriate way, right? So we want to be sure that we're not yelling at the people, that we're addressing them in a way that's appropriate for the relationship that we have. And silence is a part of that, right? Leaving them alone, letting them focus on things, and just kind of tapping them on the shoulder gently when necessary.
So you've described your work at Microsoft as developing a family of sounds, sort of a highly functional family that strives to be seamless, integrated, and beautiful. So what are some of the sounds that you've created that we would recognize, and how do you imagine them interacting with other sounds that perhaps you've created, or other technological sounds, maybe the sounds of our daily lives in general?
If you've used a Windows device in the last 15 years or so, there's a pretty good chance that some of my sounds may have become a small part of your life. I created the sounds for Windows 7, Windows 8, the short-lived Windows 8, Windows 10, and most recently Windows 11. And where, in the past, especially, in those early years when I was working on Windows 7, the sounds that I inherited at that time were all kind of very different. The set wasn't a family. It was intentionally designed to be a kind of high contrast, kind of abrasive set based on that alarm paradigm that we talked about. So to move away from that, I started, not necessarily consciously, looking back, I wish I could say that it was conscious, but I kind of slowly started creating sound design language for the platform. And at the time, that wasn't even really something that that people were thinking about consciously. I just kind of felt like intuitively this is what we need. It just doesn't feel right to have all these alarming sounds competing for our attention. And that was kind of a shift. There was sort of this tectonic shift in sound design, and also really the evolution of product sound design for technology was sort of starting around that time. We're kind of starting to become a little more mature and a little more sophisticated. So designers like me at other places were dealing with the same kinds of things and moving from this kind of fragmented soundscape to sounds that were intentionally a little more integrated. I mean, if you think about it in terms of the visual identity of the products, it would be kind of crazy to be looking at a screen and just have all these elements that really didn't relate, and not to mention confusing, right? So the idea of unity in visual design was very well established, and hardware design too, right? We're getting these really beautiful devices, increasingly beautiful and sophisticated devices, but at that time, sound design was kind of a couple generations older, and people were still used to these alarms, and they just kind of took it for granted that these really beautiful devices that had increasingly beautiful and sophisticated visual and motion design and hardware design just kind of sounded goofy or annoying, but people didn't really think too much about what it would be like to have sounds that actually aspired to the same sort of aesthetics and holistic experience as the other elements. So we were starting to think about families of sounds at that time. And I kind of slowly evolved the sound design language for Windows, which has evolved over time. I think the most frequently heard sounds are probably the primary notifications, the calendar alert sounds, and email, and in some cases messaging sounds. Now, that's not to say that the splash sounds, that the kind of startup sounds weren't important, because for a while they were, but that was when people booted up their machine every morning, desktop machine, and sometimes had to wait, went to get a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden you get this sound, da-da-da-da, that your machine's ready, in the other room, and so for a while we took out the startup sounds from Windows mobile devices and then eventually from the Windows main platform. And only recently did we put them back in. Now, I shouldn't say we. After I left, right around the time I left Microsoft a couple years ago, there was a move to put those, a little startup sound back in because it was needed for accessibility. So people who were visually impaired knew that the machine was on and ready, which makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad that has happened. But people really think of the sonic identity and the brand of the sonic branding of the tech platform as the big startup sound, like the Intel sound or the Apple sound. But the real branding the real sonic branding is in the soundscape of the UX, the user experience, and the sounds that the people hear all day long, and that create these environments where they live. So part of what we're doing with when we design an interrelated family of sounds, kind of based off the same underlying melodic DNA, is creating this kind of gently branded soundscape. So it's got an identity. And I don't want to harp too much on the branding part, but it just kind of creates this identity, right, in a really gentle way, as opposed to a single kind of da-da-da-da sound asset that people, kind of old style sonic branding, where the sound kind of gets shoved down your throat, whether you want to hear it or not. And it doesn't really provide any functional information.
Yeah, it sounds to me like maybe a score for a movie that's composed by one composer, as opposed to like a pastiche or a composite score of different sound samples from different places. That makes a lot of sense.
So most recently for the Windows 11 sounds, the language that I delivered for that was called Calm. And so it's all about sounds that are an integrated family, of course, and based on similar little melodic shapes. So they feel like a unified musical composition. If you would hear them all back to back, or in any order that you hear them, it kind of becomes this nonlinear, a little bit of a random composition, because each user, right, is going to have their own series of sounds and their own sequence, and they may change from day to day. So it's important that the sounds work together but still be intelligible enough individually. And those sounds, again, those Windows sounds, especially for Windows 11, were designed specifically to integrate well with many different kinds of environments. And I wouldn't say that 100% everywhere they're going to be perfectly audible and also perfectly calm and non-disturbing at the same time. That's a really hard dialectic to thread, not to mix my metaphors. But I think we got closer than we have in the past in terms of designing a language that was audible and seamless, that could kind of flow in and out of attention, and sometimes be in the foreground, sometimes be in the background, and have this kind of ambient quality, without taking up too much space in your environment. If something's too ambient, that can actually be a problem as well.
So speaking of sound and the absence of sound, I wonder if you have any thoughts about electric cars and how the kind of reduction of sound with those vehicles is really a safety hazard. And there's different discussion of what to kind of artificially introduce as a sound that would make them audible to pedestrians and so forth. Have you thought about that at all?
Yes, I have. And it's this kind of amazing Wild West area right now for sound design. And you have some companies doing it very, very kind of thoughtfully and with a very kind of deep design background foundation. And then you have other companies who are just like hiring a rock star or a real famous film composer to do their sound, and not even really thinking about this is an integrated product sound. This isn't about a rock star. Not that rock stars can't do great sound. Sometimes they do. But more often than not, it's about that turns into being something about the sound and the marketing of this sound done by this really famous film composer. It might be an interesting sound, but they're not the best integrated sounds for some of those reasons that we talked about. It's about empathy, right? You have to really understand what the users and listeners are, what's going on for them, what they're experiencing. And in an electric vehicle scenario, you've got the driver, but you've also got people all around that vehicle. And some people may be visually impaired or otherwise occupied. You've got these partial attention scenarios. They're not looking at the car. And then you also have this whole kind of background layer of cultural expectation, because carbon-based vehicles have a certain kind of sound, and people are used to hearing certain kinds of sounds around them when they're out in public, and they listen and cue into those sounds very quickly when the sounds get too close or when there's a problem, right? You might not hear any of the traffic sounds around you really consciously until it gets too close to you, right? It's in your space, and then it's like life or death. When you let users do anything, the first thing there's always going to be someone who customizes their sound on their device with a fart, or with a dog, or with the sound of their kid saying something, daddy, whatever. You get the full range. And that is so confusing when you've actually got a life or death situation and people don't know what's going on around them. So right now there's a whole spectrum of beautiful and questionable design going on for electric vehicles. I'm really interested to see where it's going to settle down. I've done a little work in that space myself. And it's a big challenge, but it's a huge opportunity too, because if you do it right, you're actually helping to remove a lot of the sound, of the noise pollution from urban areas. We didn't talk a whole lot about noise pollution, but that is a growing problem around the world. Reducing that is a huge public health good, right? If you can do that, but not if people end up getting killed because they don't understand the sounds or they can't hear them. So I don't have a solution for it. I would tend to say that it's probably better to move away from sound effects. Some people use carbon-based engine sounds as kind of a model, and then just sort of a digital dynamic simulation of those. That can be kind of cool. I haven't really heard any that totally nail it yet, but there are some that are getting more common. I've noticed that I'm starting to recognize as, oh, that's the sound of that electric vehicle. But there's no standard yet. I mean, all carbon-based engines pretty much sound the same. I mean, if you're an aficionado, you can tell a Porsche or Ferrari from a Chevy, but they're all basically in the same category of sound. That's not the case with EV sounds right now, and I think we're going to need some standards at some point.
So Matthew, where do you find this work you're doing on the spectrum between, is it an art or a science? Do you have like focus groups where people listen to the music, or is it a little bit more kind of intuitive in the methodology, and you just sort of know what sounds right and not?
The productive tension between the the art part and the science part has always been an important dynamic for me, because I find that I'm really drawn to both. We've talked a little more about the artistic side today, but there's a whole kind of technical and methodological side to this. I would say that I usually kind of fall a little more on the artistic, intuitive side, but it's always important to have that validated. And many, many times there have been just like little comments that people in a group or testers have made that just send me off on a whole new creative direction. So it's really important for me to always, even if it's not a formal focus group or research, to always get the sounds in front of people and let people live with them. And in some cases, I just go out in the world and listen to the sounds and see how people are interacting with them. And I can get a lot of information that way. I think it's possible for modern design, tech design culture to really over-index on focus groups and research. And, sometimes if you're asking people what they want and what they like, it can be really hard for them to tell you if they don't know. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is create sort of a new model for a global tech platform sound. And people don't really know how to think about that, right? If you ask somebody, would you like this? Or, what do you think about this idea? Or even, put some sounds in front of them. They don't necessarily understand the whole context and the whole experience. You have to really show them and let them live with it. And really, ideally, not even tell them that's what you're watching for, that's what you're looking for. Just put those sounds in, let them go out in the wild. And then at some point, maybe take them out and see how people react. And if they're like, this doesn't feel right anymore, then you nailed it, right? Or something just feels a little less alive. My experience of typing on this keyboard, this on-screen soft keyboard, doesn't feel nearly as satisfying as it used to when you had those sounds that were kind of these phantom haptic sounds. So at that point, I knew that we got them right. But a lot of those sounds are, the best sounds are often at the just noticeable threshold of perception. They're right at the threshold of perception. So you're not even really hearing them, you're more feeling them. And actually, I should have mentioned that about all our sounds. That's really true about all the sounds that I designed for Windows. They're not designed to be heard, they're more designed to be felt. So you just kind of unconsciously hear them. But if they're gone, it's like the breathing of the system, right? This respiration, you just kind of realize it's not as functional, it doesn't feel as alive, or it's a little less soulful, maybe.
One of your models for a technological landscape is the rainforest. And this may seem counterintuitive to some. So how do you see the pristine natural ecosystem informing our human-made artificial digital world?
So as an acoustic environment, the rainforest is kind of nonstop expressing a tremendous amount of information. And yet most people experience the soundscape as calm and even serene. So to me, that's a really amazing balance, right? There's a certain kind of layered and stratified structure to the sound. You've got birds in the canopy, very audible. You can tune into those. You've got the layers of insects, maybe trees and leaves and other kinds of biological materials moving on the floor, on the forest floor. You've got wind. Maybe you have rain in some cases. As humans, our brains find it pretty easy to tune into those different layers and switch between them cognitively. It's a kind of a seamless process. So as an artist and a composer, there's a lot for me to learn there. I want to understand the psychoacoustic principles behind that so that I can, whatever it is that allows that dense information environment to feel so beautiful and intelligible and seamless and calm. So there are some kind of basic principles from there that I've studied and learned and tried to apply to my work. There's a lot more to do, though. I still think they're amazing. It's an amazing data environment, right? We're talking about big data all the time. A rainforest is a big data environment, but it's also really beautiful. You can close your eyes and it just becomes this beautiful audio reality. You can know what's going on around you. You can hear birds hundreds of feet away. You can clearly disambiguate them. You're not going to get the birds mixed up usually. Each bird call has its own little identity. When you think about the complexity of what's going on there, it's amazing.
So can sound design for technology play a role in our mental health and well-being?
Absolutely. We know that the sounds in our environment have a profound effect on our mental health. So this idea of acoustic ecology necessarily includes the health and well-being of the humans at the center of the environment. And we also know that silence and quietness affect our well-being as well. That's the flip side of it. In the digital world, there can be a lot of annoying audio, and noise and unwanted sounds create anxiety, and they can even trigger the fight or flight response. And that's not good. I don't want my sounds to do damage. We have the sound designer Hippocratic Oath: first, do no harm. So the sounds of technology can be really, it can be problematic, but they can also, I think, contribute to a calm and supportive emotional texture when they're designed right. And so, yes, I do believe they deeply affect our mental health and well-being, and it can be for better or for worse. I'm trying to make it for better.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us.
Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.